the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a sinister parcel arrives at the post office, laced with arsenic and reeking of lavender, striking down the beloved postmaster, Ernest Tuttle. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wit, unravels a web of grudges, secrets, and deception. From Mr. Grimsby's lavender beds to Miss Price's watchful windows, every clue points to a cunning plot driven by wounded pride. But who is the stranger in the grey coat, and what dark motive hides in the heart of this idyllic village? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery where every stitch reveals a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The quiet village of St. Mary. Meet the morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the high street. The village, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, seemed to slumber in a timeless peace, its thatched cottages and tidy gardens undisturbed, save for the occasional trill of a blackbird or the creak of a passing cart. At the heart of this tranquil scene stood the post office, a sturdy brick building with ivy creeping up its walls, where Mr. Ernest Tuttle, the postmaster, presided with quiet efficiency. Yet, on this particular morning in late summer, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the village, as subtle as the breeze that stirred the roses in Miss Jane Marple's garden. Miss Marple, an elderly spinster with a mind as sharp as her knitting needles, sat in her favourite armchair by the window of her neat parlour. Her hands moved deftly, the soft click of needles punctuating the silence as she worked on a pale blue shawl. From her vantage point, she could observe the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead with the precision of a hawk. The butcher's boys cycled past, whistling. Mrs. Price, the sharp-tongued spinster from across the way, paused to scold a child for trampling her pansies, and the postman's van trundled toward the post office, its engine coughing like an old man with a cold. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, undimmed by age, missed nothing, and her mind, ever active, sifted the ordinary from the extraordinary. It was Janet, her maid, who brought the first whisper of trouble, bustling in with a tray of tea and scones. Janet's round face was alight with the excitement of fresh gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? Mr. Tuttle's taken ill, dreadfully ill, they say. Collapsed right in the post office, not an hour ago, after sorting the morning's post. The milkman told me, and he had it from Mrs. Tuttle herself. They've taken him to Dr. Haydock's surgery, and there's talk of something queer about a parcel he was handling." Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her fingers stilling. "A parcel, you say, Janet?" Her voice was mild, but her eyes gleamed with interest. "What sort of parcel?" Janet, eager to share, leaned forward. "Well, miss, they say it was a small one, wrapped in brown paper, with return to sender written on it in big, bold letters. And here's the odd bit: it smelled of lavender, strong enough to notice. Mrs. Tuttle said it was the last thing Ernest touched before he went all pale and faint-like, clutching his chest and gasping. They're saying it mightn't be natural." "If you take my meaning, indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts already turning like the pages of a well-read book. Lavender, she knew, was a scent often used to soothe or to conceal. She recalled a case from her youth, a distant cousin who had received a scented letter that caused a rash, later traced to a malicious tampering. Could this be similar? "Thank you, Janet," she said, rising with a sprightliness that belied her years. "I believe I shall take a walk to the post office. The air will do me good, and I might call on Mrs. Tuttle to offer my sympathies." Janet, accustomed to her mistress's quiet determination, nodded and cleared the tea tray. Miss Marple donned her straw hat, its brim adorned with a single silk rose, and stepped into the garden. The path to the post office was short, winding, past the vicarage and the greengrocer's shop, where villagers exchanged pleasantries and news with equal relish. As she walked, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the possibilities. Mr. Tuttle was a kind, unassuming man, meticulous in his work and well-liked, though not without the small frictions that marked village life. A parcel marked return to sender suggested intent, perhaps misdirection. And the lavender, why lavender? It was a question that lingered like the scent itself. At the post office, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs hushed but urgent. Mrs. Tuttle, a stout woman, with a usually cheerful demeanour, stood in the doorway, her eyes "Oh, Miss Marple," she cried, spotting the familiar figure. "It's so good of you to come. My Ernest, he's never been ill a day in his life, and now this. They say he's stable, but Dr. Haydock's keeping him for observation. I don't know what to make of it." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There, my dear. Tell me about this parcel. It sounds most unusual." Her tone was soothing, but her gaze was sharp, taking in the post office's interior, the polished counter, the pigeonholes stuffed with letters, and a faint, unmistakable whiff of lavender in the air. Mrs. Tuttle dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "It came in yesterday's post, addressed to no one in particular, just returned to sender. St. Mary Mead Post Office." Ernest thought it odd, but he sorted it as usual. This morning he was handling it again, trying to puzzle out where it came from when he took ill. The constables got it now, locked away for safekeeping. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. A parcel with no clear origin, scented with lavender, and linked to a sudden illness. It was a puzzle that demanded her attention. "I shall speak to Constable Reed," she said softly, "and perhaps Dr. Haydock. We must get to the bottom of this, for Mr. Tuttle's sake." As she left the post office, the sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the village green. St. Mary Mead might appear idyllic, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its calm exterior, motives simmered: jealousy, greed, or perhaps a grudge nursed in silence. She adjusted her hat and set off toward the surgery, her steps purposeful. The poisoned postmaster's parcel was no mere accident, and Miss Jane Marple intended to unravel its secrets, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 2. The postmasters plight the village surgery of St. Mary Mead. A low whitewashed building tucked behind a row of yew trees hummed with an air of quiet urgency as Miss Jane Marple approached its door. The morning had deepened into a warm, golden noon, and the village, though outwardly serene, seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the next ripple in the troubling affair of Mr. Ernest Tuttle's collapse. Miss Marple, her straw hat casting a faint shadow on the cobbled path, moved with the unhurried grace of one who knew the value of observation over haste. Her mind, however, was far from idle, turning over the details of the mysterious parcel like a jeweller examining a flawed gem. The scent of lavender, the cryptic address, and the postmaster's sudden illness formed a pattern, incomplete but tantalizing, and she was determined to trace its threads. Inside the surgery, the air was cool and faintly medicinal, tinged with the sharp scent of antiseptic. Dr. Haydock, a robust man with a greying moustache and a manner both brisk and kind, was just emerging from the examination room when Miss Marple entered. His face, usually genial, was creased with concern, and he greeted her with a nod that suggested he was not surprised to see her. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, I might have known you'd be along. Janet's been spreading the tale, I suppose. Well, come through. Tuttle's resting, but I can spare a moment to talk. Miss Marple followed him into a small office, its walls lined with medical journals and a cluttered desk bearing a half-drunk cup of tea. She declined a chair, preferring to stand by the window, where she could glimpse the village green and the distant post office. I understand Mr. Tuttle's condition is serious, she began, her voice soft but precise. Janet mentioned a parcel and something about lavender. I wonder, Doctor, if you might share what you've learned. Dr. Haydock leaned back, his fingers steepled. You've a nose for trouble, haven't you? Very well, Tuttle's stable now, but it was touch and go for a bit. He collapsed this morning, shortly after sorting the post, clutching his chest, sweating, and barely able to speak. Classic signs of poisoning, though not the sort you'd see from a common ailment. I've sent blood samples to the laboratory in Much Binham, but my initial tests suggest a toxin, likely absorbed through the skin or inhaled. He mentioned handling a parcel, small, wrapped in brown paper, with a strong smell of lavender, said it felt damp to the touch, which struck me as odd. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. Damp, you say, and lavender. That is most interesting. Could the poison have been in the wrapping itself, do you think? Haydock nodded slowly. It's possible. Some compounds, arsenic, for instance, or certain organic toxins can be absorbed through the skin, especially if the substance is volatile or mixed with an oil. Lavender oil could mask the scent of something nastier, though it's not my field to say for certain. The parcel's with Constable Reed now, locked in his office. I've advised him not to handle it without gloves until we know more. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind racing. Lavender oil, she knew, was a favorite among villagers for its soothing properties, used in everything from soaps to sachets. But its potency could serve a darker purpose, concealing a poison's telltale odor. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, a writer with a penchant for the dramatic, who had once described a case of poisoned gloves in a novel. The idea had seemed fanciful then, but now it resonated. Did Mr. Tuttle say anything else about the parcel? She asked. Its appearance, perhaps, or where it was to go. Haydock shook his head. He was barely coherent when they brought him in, muttered about the address. Return to sender, he said, as if it puzzled him. No name, no proper destination, just the post office itself. He'd been trying to sort it, thinking it a mistake, when he took ill. Poor man's shaken, and Mrs. Tuttle's beside herself. Miss Marple thanked him and stepped outside, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities. The surgery's garden, fragrant with late-blooming lavender, seemed to mock her with its innocent scent. She made her way to the post office, where a small knot of villagers lingered, their whispers hushed but eager. Mrs. Emily Tuttle stood behind the counter, her face pale and her hands trembling as she sorted letters with mechanical precision. The post office itself was a model of order, pigeonholes neatly labelled, a brass scale gleaming on the counter, and a faint, lingering trace of lavender in the air, as if the parcel's scent had seeped into the very walls. Mrs. Tuttle, Miss Marple said gently, approaching the counter. I was so sorry to hear of Mr. Tuttle's illness. How is he faring? Mrs. Tuttle's eyes filled with tears, but she straightened, clutching a bundle of envelopes. He's resting, Miss Marple, thank you. Dr. Haydock says he'll pull through, but it's been a shock. Ernest is never sick, you know. He's always so careful, so particular. And now this wretched parcel. Her voice broke, and she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone soothing. "Tell me about the parcel, my dear. Every detail helps. When did it arrive, and what was it like?" Mrs. Tuttle took a shaky breath. "It came yesterday, with the afternoon post. Just a small package, no bigger than a book, wrapped in plain brown paper. The address was written in black ink, bold, and looping, like someone took care with it. Return to sender, St. Mary Mead Post Office," it said, nothing more. Ernest thought it odd, no sender's name, no proper address, but he set it aside to deal with today. This morning he was holding it, turning it over, trying to make sense of it, when he started to feel poorly. He said it smelled strongly of lavender, and the paper felt sticky, like it had been oiled. That's when he collapsed, right there by the sorting table. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag, though her face betrayed no excitement. "Sticky, you say? And the lavender, was it a pleasant scent, or overpowering?" "Overpowering," Mrs. Tuttle said firmly. "I noticed it myself when I came to help him. It wasn't like the lavender sachets I make for the linen cupboard too. Strong, almost chemical. I thought it was just some fancy wrapping at first, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. The sticky paper suggested a deliberate application of something poison, perhaps, as Dr. Haydock suspected. The address, returned to sender, was a clever ruse, ensuring the parcel would remain in Mr. Tuttle's hands, increasing the likelihood. He would handle it repeatedly. But who would wish harm on the mild-mannered postmaster? St. Mary Mead, for all its charm, was not without its petty rivalries, and Miss Marple knew that even the smallest grudge could fester into something dangerous. "Did anyone else handle the parcel?" she asked. "Or was there anything unusual about the post office yesterday's visitors, perhaps, or unfamiliar faces?" Mrs. Tuttle frowned, thinking, "No one else touched it, as far as I know. Ernest is particular about the sorting, he does it himself. As for visitors, it was the usual crowd. Mrs. Clement for her stamps, Mr. Grimsby to post a letter, Miss Price to complain about a delayed parcel. Oh, and there was a stranger, now I think of it, a man in a grey coat, middle-aged, who posted a package late yesterday. He didn't say much, just handed it over and left. I didn't see the address, but it might have been the one." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she kept her tone light. "A stranger, you say? How curious. And Mr. Grimsby, did he seem himself?" Mrs. Tuttle hesitated. "Well, he was a bit short with Ernest, now you mention it. They've had words before, you know, about some letters Ernest supposedly missed. Lionel Mr. Grimsby was quite put out, said it cost him a deal with a seed supplier. But he's always been one for holding grudges, hasn't he?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, recalling Mr. Lionel Grimsby's fastidious nature and his prized lavender beds. She had seen them only last week, their purple spikes swaying in the breeze, and had noted his pride in their cultivation. Could his knowledge of plants extend to something more sinister? And Miss Price, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, was no stranger to feuds, having clashed with Mrs. Tuttle over a trivial matter months ago. The stranger in the grey coat, however, was a new element, and Miss Marple filed it away for later consideration. She thanked Mrs. Tuttle and stepped outside, pausing to survey the village. The post office stood opposite the greengrocer's, where a boy was stacking apples, and beyond it the church spire rose against a sky of deepening blue. The lavender scent lingered in her memory, a clue that seemed to point both everywhere and nowhere. She resolved to speak to Constable Reed, Who was likely at the police house, a modest cottage at the edge of the village. As she walked, her steps measured and her eyes alert, she considered the motives that might drive such an act. Envy, perhaps, or revenge for a perceived slight. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, who had once remarked that village life was like a tapestry beautiful from a distance, but up close, full of tangled threads. At the police house, Constable Reed, a young man with an earnest face and a tendency to blush under scrutiny, was sorting through a stack of papers. The parcel, wrapped in its ominous brown paper, sat in a locked box on his desk, its presence almost palpable. "Miss Marple," he said, standing hastily, "I suppose you're here about Tuttle. It's a queer business, isn't it? Dr. Haydock's warned me not to touch the parcel without gloves, and I've sent word to the inspector. In much Benham, but I'll let you have a look, if you like carefully, mind." Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. "You're very kind, Constable. I shan't disturb it, but I'd like to see it, if I may." Reed unlocked the box and, using a pair of tongs, lifted the parcel onto a clean sheet of paper. It was, as Mrs. Tuttle had described, small, neatly wrapped, with bold, looping handwriting that declared return to sender, St. Mary Mead Post Office. The lavender scent was unmistakable, sharp and almost cloying, and Miss Marple noted a faint sheen on the paper, as if it had been brushed with oil. "Most unusual," she said softly, her fingers itching to examine it closer, but restrained by caution. "The handwriting is distinctive, don't you think? And the scent quite deliberate, I imagine." Reed scratched his head. "Deliberate? You think someone meant to harm Tuttle? But who'd do such a thing? He's as harmless as they come." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained grave. "Harmless people, Constable, often attract the envy of those less content. We must consider who might have had access to the post office, and perhaps a reason to wish Mr. Tuttle ill. The handwriting may be a clue, if we can find its match." She left the police house, her mind buzzing with questions. The parcel's design suggested calculation, a mind both cunning and patient. The lavender, the sticky paper, the ambiguous address all pointed to someone who knew the post office's routines and Mr. Tuttle's habits. As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of early afternoon, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a mystery unfolding. She would need to speak to Mr. Grimsby and Miss Price, and perhaps inquire about the stranger in the grey coat, but for now, the scent of lavender clung to her thoughts. A fragrant riddle that promised answers, if only she could find the right thread to pull. Chapter 3. The mysterious parcel. The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across the village green as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the police house. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of cut grass and blooming honeysuckle, but her thoughts were far from the idyllic scene. The troubling matter of Mr. Tuttle's collapse, linked to a peculiar parcel scented with lavender, had stirred her curiosity to a fine pitch. She walked with her usual unhurried grace, her straw hat tilted against the light, but her pale blue eyes were alert, scanning the village for any hint of the unusual. The post office, now quiet save for the occasional clink of Mrs. Tuttle sorting letters, stood as a silent witness to the morning's drama, and Miss Marple knew that the parcel itself held the key to unravelling the mystery. Constable Reed's police house, a modest cottage with a neatly trimmed hedge, was a short walk from the high street. Its front room, converted into an office, was a study in orderly chaos, a desk cluttered with reports, a bicycle propped against the wall, and a small safe where the offending Parcel now resided. Reed, a young man with a ruddy complexion and an earnest desire to prove himself, looked up from his paperwork as Miss Marple entered. His face brightened, though a flicker of apprehension crossed his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, standing, "I thought you might come by again. You've a knack for these things, haven't you?" "The parcel's safe, as Dr. Haydock ordered. Would you like to see it?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming as always. "If it's no trouble, Constable, I should like to examine it, though I assure you I shan't touch it. One cannot be too careful, can one?" Reed nodded, retrieving a pair of gloves from his desk drawer. "Right you are. Dr. Haydock was firm about that no handling without precautions. The inspector from Much Benham's coming tomorrow, but I'll show you now, if you're careful." He unlocked the safe and, with a pair of tongs, carefully lifted the parcel onto a clean sheet of blotting paper. It was a small package, no larger than a slim volume of poetry, wrapped in plain brown paper. The address, written in bold, looping, black ink, read simply, "Returned to sender, St. Mary Mead Post Office." The scent of lavender was immediate and potent. Not the gentle fragrance of a sachet, but something sharper, almost medicinal. That caught in the throat. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes tracing every detail. The paper was slightly crumpled at the edges, as if handled roughly, and bore a faint sheen, particularly around the address. She noted the texture smooth, almost waxy, suggesting it had been treated with something. "Most curious," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The paper feels deliberate, don't you think? As if it were meant to be noticed, or perhaps to linger in one's hands." Reed, standing awkwardly with the tongs, frowned. "Deliberate? You mean someone planned for Tuttle to handle it? But why mark it returned to sender? It's bound to cause confusion." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, straightening. "Confusion can be a tool, Constable. If the parcel was meant for Mr. Tuttle, the address ensures he would handle it himself. Perhaps repeatedly, as he tried to puzzle out its origin. And the lavender's such a strong scent. It suggests intent, does it not? To mask something, perhaps, or to draw attention." Reed scratched his chin, clearly out of his depth, but willing to listen. "You think the lavender's part of it? Not just some fancy wrapping?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "Lavender has many uses, Constable. It soothes, it perfumes, but it can also conceal. I recall a case in my youth. A lady in my village received a scented letter that caused a rash. It was later found to contain a chemical irritant masked by the fragrance. We must consider whether this parcel hides something similar." She stepped back, allowing Reed to return the parcel to the safe. As he locked it away, she asked, "Did Mr. Tuttle mention anything else about the parcel's handling? Were there other packages with it, or did anyone show particular interest in the post?" "Yesterday?" Reed thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Tuttle didn't say much, being so poorly when they brought him in. But Mrs. Tuttle mentioned the parcel came with the afternoon post yesterday. No one else handled it, far as we know. Tuttle's particular about sorting. As for interest, well, the post office is always busy. Mrs. Clement was in for stamps, Mr. Grimsby posted a letter, and Miss Price was there, complaining as usual. Oh, and there was that stranger Mrs. Tuttle mentioned, a man in a grey coat, who posted a package late in the day. Could have been this one, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the names. Mr. Grimsby, with his lavender beds and His grudge against Tuttle was an obvious candidate for suspicion. Miss Price, too, with her sharp eyes and sharper grudges, could not be dismissed. The stranger, however, was an enigma, loose thread in the tapestry of the village. "Thank you, Constable," she said. "I think I shall take a stroll and consider this further. Do keep the parcel safe, and let me know if the inspector finds anything of note." As she left the police house, the village was settling into the drowsy warmth of the afternoon. Children played on the green, their laughter mingling with the hum of bees. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The parcel's peculiarities, the looping handwriting, the sticky paper, the overpowering lavender suggested a mind both cunning and precise. She recalled a conversation with her friend, Mrs. Bantry, who had once described a village feud that escalated into sabotage over a misdelivered letter. Could a similar resentment lie at the heart of this affair? Mr. Tuttle, though mild-mannered, was not without enemies, for even the kindest souls could provoke envy or irritation in a small community. Her steps took her past Mr. Grimsby's cottage, where the lavender beds glowed in the sunlight, their fragrance heavy in the air. She paused ostensibly to admire the flowers, but her eyes lingered on the garden shed, its door slightly ajar. Grimsby was nowhere to be seen but the sheds. Contents bottles and jars glimpsed through the crack hinted at his interest in more than just gardening. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further. Perhaps under the guise of seeking gardening advice, she continued to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was pruning roses in the front garden. Mrs. Clement, a cheerful woman, with a knack for village gossip, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, what a dreadful business about poor Mr. Tuttle. Have you heard the latest? They say it was a parcel that did it, something sinister, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling onto a garden bench. "Indeed, I've just come from the police house. The parcel is quite the puzzle, isn't it? I understand. You were at the post office yesterday. Did you notice anything unusual?" Mrs. Clement snipped a wilted bloom, her eyes bright with the thrill of being questioned. "Well, now, let me think. It was the usual bustle, Mrs. Tuttle behind the counter, Ernest sorting in the back. I was buying stamps for the church newsletter when Mr. Grimsby came in, looking cross as you please. He posted a letter, but he was muttering about Ernest misdelivering something important, a seed order, I think. He's been sore about it for weeks, you know." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And Miss Price, was she there as well?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Clement said, rolling her eyes. "She was in a state, complaining about a parcel that hadn't arrived. Said Mrs. Tuttle was careless. Which is nonsense, of course. Lavinia Price does love her grievances. But the oddest thing was that man in the grey coat. I saw him just as I was leaving, a tall fellow, middle-aged, with a scarf pulled up high. He handed Mrs. Tuttle a package and left without a word. I thought it peculiar, but then strangers do pass through now and then." Miss Marple's interest quickened, though she kept her tone light. "A stranger, you say? Did you see the package he posted?" Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Not closely. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, but I didn't catch the address. He was in and out, so quickly I barely had time to notice." Thanking Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple took her leave, her mind a whirl of connections. The stranger's package matched the description of the poisoned parcel, but his fleeting presence suggested he was not a local. Could he be a hired hand, acting on behalf of someone in the village? Or was he a distraction, a shadow cast to obscure the true culprit? She thought of Mr. Grimsby's shed, with its array of bottles, and Miss Price's habit of watching the post office from her cottage window. Both had opportunity and perhaps motive, but the handwriting and the lavender were the keys to unlocking the truth. As she returned home, the village was bathed in the soft light of late afternoon, the church bells tolling softly in the distance. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her eyes lingering on the post office across the green. The parcel's design was no accident, it was a trap carefully set for Mr. Tuttle. But why? A grudge over a misdelivered letter seemed petty, yet she knew from experience that small slights could fester into dangerous obsessions. She recalled a case in her youth where a neighbor had sent anonymous letters laced with a mild irritant, all because of a disputed garden boundary. The parallel was striking, but this affair was darker, more deliberate. Entering her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as she stared out the window. The lavender scent, the sticky paper, the cryptic address, they formed a pattern, one she was determined to decipher. She would need to speak to Mr. Grimsby and Miss Price, and perhaps inquire further about the stranger. For now, she closed her eyes, letting her mind wander through the village's hidden corners, where secrets lay waiting to be unravelled, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 4. The neighbours' secrets. The late afternoon light draped St. Mary Mead in a golden veil, softening the edges of its thatched cottages and casting intricate shadows across the village green. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the faint hum of village life, children's laughter, the clatter of a milk cart, the distant bark of a dog. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, Miss Jane Marple sensed a current of unease, as if the village itself were holding its breath after the troubling incident at the post office. Her morning's inquiries had left her with a vivid picture of the poisoned parcel, its bold, looping handwriting, its cloying lavender scent, its sticky shen, but the motive behind Mr. Tuttle's affliction remained elusive. As she walked along the high street, her steps measured and her straw hat tilted against the sun, her mind sifted through the clues, seeking the human frailties that so often lay at the heart of such mysteries. Miss Marple's destination was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was known to hold court over tea and gossip, her parlour a hub of village intelligence. The vicarage, a rambling house with roses climbing its walls, stood just beyond the church, its windows glinting in the afternoon light. Miss Marple knocked softly, and Mrs. Clement herself opened the door, her round face breaking into a smile. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Come in, I've just put the kettle on. I suppose you're here about poor Mr. Tuttle. The whole village is talking of nothing else." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair in the parlour, accepting a cup of Earl Grey with a nod of thanks. The room was cosy, cluttered with books and framed photographs, and the air carried the faint scent of beeswax polish. "It is a most distressing affair," she said, her voice soft but precise. "I've been to the police house and spoken with Mrs. Tuttle. The parcel seems quite peculiar, don't you think? I wondered if you might have heard anything more village talk, perhaps about Mr. Tuttle or the post office." Mrs. Clement's eyes gleamed with the delight of sharing news. She leaned forward, her teacup balanced precariously. "Oh, it's all anyone can speak of. Poor Ernest, struck down so suddenly, and that queer parcel with its lavender smell. They say it was poisoned, though I can't imagine who'd do such a thing. But, well, you know how villagers are, there's always someone with a grudge." She paused, glancing toward the window as if to ensure they were alone. "There's been talk about Mr. Grimsby, you know, Lionel Grimsby from Rose Cottage. He and Ernest had been at odds for months. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression encouraging but neutral. Mr. Grimsby, I recall he has those splendid lavender beds. What sort of trouble, exactly? Mrs. Clement lowered her voice, though the parlour was empty save for them. It started over a misdelivered letter, or so Lionel claims, he says. Ernest sent a package meant for him to old Mrs. Harrow, and it contained important papers for a seed supplier. Lionel lost a contract because of it, and he's been furious ever since. I saw him at the post office last week, red in the face, accusing Ernest of carelessness. Ernest was calm, as always, but you could tell it stung. Lionel's not one to let things go. He's particular, always has been, and he's been known to hold a grudge longer than most. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. Grimsby's lavender beds, so admired in the village, took on a new significance in light of the parcel's scent. Could his expertise with plants extend to something more sinister? She recalled a distant acquaintance, a gardener who had once concocted a homemade pesticide that caused a rash among his neighbours. The parallel was not exact, but it lingered in her thoughts. And was Mr. Grimsby at the post office yesterday? She asked, her tone deceptively casual. Oh, yes, Mrs. Clement said, reaching for a biscuit. I saw him myself, posting a letter just before closing. He was in a mood, muttering to himself, though I couldn't catch the words. And then there's Miss Price, Lavinia Price, you know, from Willow Cottage. She was there too, making a fuss about a parcel that hadn't arrived. She's always had a sharp tongue, and she's never been fond of the Tuttles, not since that silly business with the borrowed book. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained serene. A book, you say? What happened there? Mrs. Clement chuckled, though there was a hint of unease in her tone. It was months ago, but Lavinia hasn't forgotten. She lent Mrs. Tuttle a novelsome romance she was fond of. It came back with a torn page. Lavinia was livid, said it was careless, and she's been cool to the Tuttles ever since. It's a small thing, I know, but you know how Lavinia is. She nurses her grievances like prize roses. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her fingers resting lightly on the saucer. How very interesting. Small slights can weigh heavily in a village, can't they? And this stranger, Mrs. Tuttle, mentioned the man in the grey coat. Did you see him? At all? Mrs. Clement frowned, thinking, I did, now you mention it. A tall man, rather ordinary, with a scarf pulled up high. He came in just as I was leaving, handed Mrs. Tuttle a package, and was gone before I could get a good look. I thought he seemed in a hurry, but strangers often are, passing through on their way to Much Benham. Thanking Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple took her leave, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The vicarage garden was a riot of colour, but she scarcely noticed as she walked back to the high street. Grimsby's feud with Tuttle, rooted in a professional slight, was a promising lead, and his lavender beds made him a natural suspect. Miss Price's resentment, though seemingly trivial, could not be dismissed. Miss Marple knew from experience that petty grudges could inspire outsized malice. The stranger, however, was a puzzle. His fleeting presence suggested an outsider, yet the parcel's design implied intimate knowledge of the post office's routines. Could he be a hired agent, or merely a coincidence? Her steps took her past Willow Cottage, where Miss Lavinia Price lived, its windows offering a clear view of the post office across the green. The curtains twitched slightly, and Miss Marple suspected Miss Price was watching, as was her habit. She made a mental note to call on her later, perhaps with an excuse about a church fundraiser. For now, she turned toward Rose Cottage, where Mr. Grimsby resided. His garden was a spectacle, its lavender bushes in full bloom, their purple spikes swaying gently in the breeze. The scent was strong, almost overwhelming, and Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire the flowers, but her eyes were sharp. Noting the path to the garden shed, she knocked on the cottage door, and after a moment Mr. Grimsby appeared, tall and wiry, his face set in a guarded expression. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but cool, "to what do I owe the visit? Come to see the lavender, I suppose." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as disarming as ever. "Indeed, Mr. Grimsby, your garden is the talk of the village. I was passing by and couldn't resist a closer look. You must have quite a knack for cultivation." Grimsby's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "It's a labour of love. Lavender's trick in it's the right soil, the right pruning. I've spent years getting it just so." He gestured toward the beds, and Miss Marple followed, her gaze drifting to the shed. Its door was closed now, but she recalled the glimpse of bottles and jars from her earlier pass. "You must use lavender for many things," she said innocently. "Oils, perhaps, or sachets. I've heard it's quite versatile." Grimsby hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "Oh yes, soaps, mostly, and a bit of oil for the house. Nothing fancy." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw. She glanced at the shed again, her curiosity piqued. "Your garden is a credit to you," she said, turning back to him. "I suppose you must be busy with it, especially with the post office so close. It must be convenient for sending your seed orders." Grimsby's face darkened, and he crossed his arms. "Convenient when the postmaster does his job properly. Tuttle's made a mess of things before. Sent my papers to the wrong house. Cost me a deal. He's not as careful as he thinks." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression sympathetic. How frustrating that must have been. "I'm sure Mr. Tuttle meant no harm, but mistakes do happen, don't they?" Grimsby grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Some mistakes are harder to forgive than others." He turned back to the cottage, signalling the conversation's end. Miss Marple thanked him and departed, her mind buzzing. Grimsby's resentment was palpable, and his knowledge of lavender made him a compelling suspect. The shed, with its mysterious contents, warranted further investigation as she walked home. The village was settling into the quiet of early evening, the sky streaked with pink and gold. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her eyes lingering on the post office, the parcel's lavender scent, Grimsby's grudge, Miss Price's bitterness. The stranger's fleeting visit, these were threads in a complex tapestry, and she was determined to weave them together. She recalled a case from her youth, where a neighbour had sent poisoned sweets to settle a score over a garden competition. The motive had seemed trivial, but the intent was deadly. Could a similar pettiness lie behind this affair? Entering her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The lavender scent haunted her thoughts, a fragrant clue that pointed to both opportunity and intent. She would need to speak to Miss Price, whose watchful eyes might hold more than gossip, and perhaps revisit Grimsby's shed under some pretext. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the villager's secrets unfold in her mind, each detail a stitch in the pattern of a crime that was both clever and cruel. Chapter 5. A visit to Mr. Grimsby. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose as the day eased into evening. The air was soft, laced with the sweet tang of late summer blooms. But Miss Jane Marple's thoughts were far from the tranquil beauty around her. The troubling affair of Mr. Tuttle's collapse, linked to a lavender-scented parcel, had woven itself into a puzzle that demanded her full attention. Her inquiries thus far, the parcels, sticky paper, its bold handwriting, the whispered grudges of neighbours had only deepened the mystery. Now, as she walked along the winding lane toward Rose Cottage, where Mr. Lionel Grimsby tended his renowned lavender beds, she felt the familiar stir of anticipation, like a knitter sensing the pattern. Emerging from a tangle of yarn, Miss Marple's decision to call on Grimsby was not impulsive. His name had surfaced repeatedly in her conversations. Mrs. Clement's account of his feud with Mr. Tuttle over a misdelivered letter, Mrs. Tuttle's mention of his presence at the post office the day before the incident, and the inescapable fact of his lavender expertise. The scent that clung to the poisoned parcel was too precise a detail to ignore, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond the obvious, suspected that Grimsby's garden held more than just flowers. Her straw hat tilted against the fading light. She moved with her characteristic blend of purpose and discretion, her eyes scanning the cottages and hedgerows for any hint of the unusual. Rose Cottage stood at the edge of the village, its whitewashed walls glowing softly in the dusk. The garden was a spectacle, its lavender bushes forming orderly rows that shimmered with purple spikes, their fragrance heavy and almost intoxicating. Miss Marple paused at the gate, ostensibly to admire the blooms, but her gaze lingered on the small shed at the garden's far end. She had glimpsed its contents, earlier bottles and jars, some labelled with chemical names, and the memory sharpened her resolve. Grimsby, a retired clerk with a meticulous nature, was not a man given to carelessness. If he was involved, every detail would be calculated. She knocked on the cottage door, her tap light but firm. After a moment, Mr. Grimsby appeared, his tall, wiry frame filling the doorway. His face, lined and weathered, bore a guarded expression, and his grey eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but edged with wariness. "This is unexpected. Come to see the garden, I take it." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as disarming as a summer breeze. "Indeed, Mr. Grimsby, your lavender is quite the talk of St. Mary Mead. I was passing by and thought I might trouble you for a closer look. I've always admired a well-kept garden, and yours is a marvel." Grimsby's shoulders relaxed, though his eyes remained cautious. "Kind of you to say so. It's hard work. Mind lavender's particular about soil and sun. Would you care to walk the beds?" He gestured toward the garden, and Miss Marple nodded, falling into step beside him. The lavender's scent enveloped them, rich and heady, and she noted how it mirrored the sharp, almost chemical fragrance of the parcel. Could it be a coincidence, or was it a clue deliberately planted? "Your knowledge must extend beyond flowers," she remarked, her tone light. "Lavender oil, I imagine, is one of your specialties. I've heard it's used for all manner of thing, soaps, sachets, even remedies." Grimsby's step faltered, though he recovered quickly. "Oh, a bit of oil now and then," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I make some for the housekeeps. The moths away. Nothing too complicated." He pointed to a cluster of blooms, as if to change the subject. "These are Hidcote, best for oil. Need pruning just so, or they'll go woody." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the shed. Its door was ajar, revealing a sliver of its contents. Shelves lined with bottles, a workbench cluttered with tools. "You must have quite a collection of supplies," she said innocently. I suppose you mix your own fertilizers. My nephew Raymond swears by homemade concoctions, though I confess I know little about it. Grimsby's jaw tightened, and he moved to block her view of the shed. Just the usual compost, bone meal, a bit of lime. Nothing out of the ordinary. His tone was curt, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to close the shed door entirely. She smiled, undeterred, and turned her attention to a nearby bush, bending to inspect its leaves. "Such a lovely scent," she said, straightening. "It reminds me of a parcel at the post office quite. A strong lavender smell, they say. Poor Mr. Tuttle was handling it when he took ill. You've heard about that, I presume?" Grimsby's face darkened, and he crossed his arms. "I heard. A bad business. Tuttle's always been careless, though probably touched something he shouldn't have. Not my concern." His words were clipped, and Miss Marple detected a note of defensiveness. She recalled Mrs. Clemens' account of his anger over a misdelivered letter, a grievance that had cost him a business deal. Could such a slight have festered into something more sinister? "I'm sure you're right," she said soothingly. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how a scent like lavender can linger?" The parcel was marked "Returned to sender." "I understand, most unusual. I suppose you didn't notice anything odd at the post office yesterday? You were there, I believe." Grimsby's eyes flickered, and he turned to pluck a dead bloom from a bush, his movements deliberate. "I posted a letter, that's all. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary." Tuttle was sorting. Mrs. Tuttle was at the counter, same as always. "If there was a parcel, I didn't notice it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. His denial was too quick, too practiced. She glanced at the shed again, noting a bottle on the workbench with a handwritten label, its ink dark and bold. Could it match the parcel's looping script? She made a mental note to find a sample of Grimsby's handwriting, perhaps a letter to the village council, icily obtained through Constable Reed. As they walked back toward the cottage, Miss Marple steered the conversation to safer ground, complimenting the garden's layout and asking about pruning techniques. Grimsby relaxed slightly, warming to the topic, but his eyes darted occasionally to the shed, as if guarding a secret. At the gate she paused, her gaze sweeping the lavender beds. "You've created something truly remarkable here," she said. "I must ask you for advice when I try my own lavender next spring. Perhaps you could recommend an oil recipe." Grimsby hesitated, then nodded curtly. "I'll jot something down sometime. Good evening, Miss Marple." He turned back to the cottage, and she watched him go, noting the stiffness in his posture. As she closed the gate, her eyes lingered on the shed, its contents a tantalizing mystery. She would need to find a way to inspect it more closely, perhaps under the guise of borrowing a gardening tool. The village was settling into twilight as she walked home, the sky a deepening indigo streaked with gold. The church bells tolled softly, a reminder of the rhythm of St. Mary Mead's life, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Grimsby's guarded demeanour, his expertise with lavender, his unresolved grudge against Tuttle pointed to a man with both opportunity and motive. Yet she could not dismiss Miss Price, whose cottage overlooked the post office and whose bitterness toward the Tuttles was well known. Nor could she ignore the stranger in the grey coat, a figure who seemed to vanish as quickly as he appeared. At her cottage, Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes drifting to the post office across the green. The building was dark now, its windows reflecting the last light of day, but its secrets seemed to pulse in the air. She entered her parlour, where Janet had left a tray of tea and biscuits and settled into her armchair. Her knitting lay untouched, for her mind was too occupied with the puzzle at hand. The lavender scent, the sticky paper, the cryptic address, they were pieces of a design, carefully crafted to ensnare Mr. Tuttle. But why? A business dispute, a personal slight, or something deeper? She recalled a case from her youth, where a neighbor had laced a gift with a mild toxin to settle a score over a lost dog. The motive had seemed trivial, but the intent was real, driven by a quiet, festering rage. Grimsby's anger over the misdelivered letter, though seemingly small, could have grown into something more dangerous, especially if his pride was wounded. Miss Price's grudge, too, though rooted in a torn book, might have taken a darker turn. And the stranger, could he be a pawn, hired to deliver the parcel and deflect suspicion? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the darkening garden beyond her window. She would need to speak to Miss Price, whose watchful nature might yield new insights, and find a way to examine Grimsby's shed. A sample of his handwriting was essential, for the parcel's bold script was a clue that could not be ignored. For now, she let her thoughts settle, each detail a thread in the tapestry of a crime that was both clever and cruel. The lavender scent lingered in her mind, a fragrant riddle that promised answers, if only she could find the right stitch to unravel it. Chapter 6. Miss Price's observations. The twilight had deepened over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a soft, violet hush as the stars began to prick through the indigo sky. The day's warmth lingered in the air, mingling with the faint perfume of roses and the distant hum of evening activity, dog's bark, the clink of dishes from a nearby cottage, the soft tread of a villager returning home. Miss Jane Marple, however, was undeterred by the hour, her mind as alert as ever, turning over the troubling affair of the poisoned parcel that had struck down Mr. Tuttle. Her visit to Mr. Grimsby had sharpened her suspicions. His guarded demeanour, and the tantalizing glimpse of his shed's contents suggesting a man with secrets. Yet the puzzle was far from complete, and her thoughts now turned to another figure in the village's intricate tapestry, Miss Lavinia Price, whose cottage windows offered a clear view of the post office, and whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper grudges. Miss Marple's decision to call on Miss Price was calculated. The spinster's reputation for observing the village's comings and goings was unmatched. Her cottage strategically positioned to catch every movement at the post office. If anyone had seen something unusual the day the parcel arrived, it would be Lavinia Price. Miss Marple adjusted her straw hat. Its silk rose catching the last glimmers of light, and set out along the high street, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was quiet, save for the occasional flicker of lamplight in a window, and she felt the weight of its secrets pressing around her, like threads waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. Willow Cottage, Miss Price's home, was a neat, square building with ivy trailing up its walls and a garden meticulously tended, though less showy than Grimsby's lavender beds. Its front windows, framed by crisp lace curtains, faced the post office directly, offering an unobstructed view of the comings and goings across the green. Miss Marple knocked softly, and after a moment the door opened to reveal Miss Price herself. A thin woman with sharp features and eyes that gleamed with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Her grey hair was pinned tightly, and her apron suggested she had been baking, though the faint scent of lavender in the air gave Miss Marple pause. "Miss Marple," Miss Price said, her voice cool but polite. "This is a surprise, I suppose. You're here about the post office business. The whole village is buzzing with it. Come in, if you must." She stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered, noting the parlour's Spartan tidiness. A single armchair, a small table with a vase of dried lavender, and a bookshelf lined with novels, their spines worn but orderly. "Thank you, Miss Price," Miss Marple said, settling into the offered chair. "I won't keep you long. I've been speaking to Mrs. Tuttle and others about poor Mr. Tuttle's illness. It's a most distressing affair, and I understand you were at the post office yesterday. I thought you might have noticed something that could help." Miss Price's lips thinned, and she sat opposite, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Was there, yes, making a complaint about a parcel that never arrived. Emily Tuttle is all smiles, but she's careless, and Ernest is no better. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, if that's what you're asking. Just the usual bustle. Clement buying stamps, Mr. Grimsby posting a letter, and that stranger who came in late." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression encouraging. "A stranger, you say? Mrs. Clement mentioned him, a man in a grey coat, I believe. Did you see him clearly?" Miss Price's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clear enough. Tall, middle-aged, with a scarf pulled up high, as if he didn't want to be recognized. He handed Mrs. Tuttle a small package brown paper, neatly wrapped hand was gone before you could blink. I thought it odd, the way he hurried off. Strangers don't often come to the post office, not that late." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. The stranger's package matched the description of the poisoned parcel, but his fleeting presence suggested he was not a local. Could he be a hired courier acting on behalf of someone in the village? She recalled a case from her youth where a hired messenger had delivered a tampered gift to settle a village feud. The parallel was not exact, but it lingered. "And Mr. Grimsby," she said, steering the conversation gently. "I understand he was there as well. Did he seem himself?" Miss Price's lips curled into a faint sneer. "Lionel Grimsby. He was skulking about, as usual. Posted a letter, but he was muttering to himself, looking cross. I saw him linger near the postbox after, peering at it as if he expected something to happen. He's always been a meddler, that one, and he's no friend of the Tuttles. Thinks himself above everyone, with his precious lavender and his airs." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "I see, in you, Miss Price, with your excellent view of the post office. Did you notice anything else that day? Perhaps someone loitering, or an unusual delivery?" Miss Price hesitated, her fingers tightening in her lap. "Well, I don't make a habit of spying, but I do keep an eye out. The post office is right there, after all. I saw nothing unusual except for that stranger. And Grimsby, of course, acting furtive. But then, he's always poking his nose where it doesn't belong." Her tone was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the undercurrent of disdain. Miss Price's feud with the Tuttles, sparked by a torn book, was well known, and her bitterness seemed to extend to Grimsby as well. "I'm sure your observations are most valuable," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "It's remarkable how much one can see from a well-placed window. And the lavender scent on the parcel's such a curious detail. You use lavender yourself, I see." She gestured to the vase on the table, its dried blooms releasing a faint fragrance. Miss Price stiffened, her eyes flashing. "A few sprigs for the house, that's all. Everyone uses lavender, it's common enough. I don't see what it has to do with anything." Her defensiveness was palpable, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Could Miss Price's resentment have driven her to a more sinister act, Or was her sharpness merely a mask for her usual discontent? As they spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the bookshelf where a stack of papers caught her eye. Among them was a letter, its envelope bearing a bold, looping script that struck her as familiar. It was too far to read, but the similarity to the parcel's handwriting was striking. She resolved to find a way to examine it closer, perhaps by asking about a book. "You have quite a collection," she said, nodding toward the shelf. "I've been meaning to borrow a novel, perhaps. That one there, near your letters." Miss Price's face tightened, and she rose quickly, moving to the shelf. "These are private," she said, her tone curt as she tucked the letters behind a book. "But I can lend you a novel, if you like. This one's good." She handed Miss Marple a worn copy of a romance, her movements brisk. Miss Marple accepted the book with a smile, noting the speed with which Miss Price had concealed the letters. "Thank you, my dear. I shall return it promptly, and I do hope Mr. Tuttle recovers soon. It's such a worry for the village." Miss Price nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It is. I may not care for the Tuttles, but I wouldn't wish this on anyone." Her words were sincere, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if she feared her own bitterness had been too apparent. As Miss Marple took her leave, the village was cloaked in full darkness, the stars bright above the silent cottages. She walked slowly, her mind a whirl of impressions. Miss Price's observations confirmed the stranger's presence and Grimsby's suspicious behaviour, but her defensiveness about the lavender and the letters suggested she, too, had secrets. The handwriting on the parcel was a crucial clue, and Miss Marple resolved to obtain a sample of Miss Price's writing. Perhaps through a church committee list she knew the spinster maintained. The post office loomed across the green, its windows dark, but its presence heavy with unanswered questions. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her eyes lingering on the building. The lavender scent, the sticky paper, the cryptic address, they formed a deliberate trap, designed to ensnare Mr. Tuttle. Grimsby's grudge and his shed's contents made him a compelling suspect, but Miss Price's watchful nature and hidden letters could not be dismissed. The stranger remained an enigma, a shadow that might obscure the true culprit. Entering her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the lamplight casting soft shadows across the parlour. Her knitting lay untouched, for her thoughts were too occupied with the puzzle at hand. She recalled a case from her youth, where a spinster had sent anonymous notes to settle a score over a church bazaar. The motive had been petty, but the malice real, driven by a quiet, festering resentment. Could Miss Price's anger over a torn book have escalated into something darker, or was Grimsby's wounded pride the true catalyst? The stranger's role, if any, remained unclear, but Miss Marple knew that every detail mattered, each a stitch in the pattern of a crime that was both cunning and cruel. Chapter 7. The scent of deception. The night had settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, the village cloaked in a stillness broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The moon cast a silvery glow across the cottages, their thatched roofs gleaming faintly, but Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a single lamp burning, was far from the tranquil scene outside. Her mind, sharp and restless, turned over the troubling affair of the poisoned parcel that had struck down Mr. Ernest Tuttle. The clues she had gathered, the lavender-scented wrapping, the bold looping handwriting, the sticky sheen of the paper formed a pattern, intricate but incomplete. Her visits to Mr. Grimsby and Miss Price had deepened her suspicions, yet the motive and the culprit remained elusive. like a thread just out of reach in her knitting dot. Miss Marple's parlour was a haven of order, its shelves lined with books, a vase of late roses on the table, and her knitting basket tucked beside her armchair. Yet tonight her needles lay untouched, for her thoughts were consumed by the mystery. The lavender scent, so prominent in the parcel, was no mere flourish. It suggested a deliberate attempt to mask something sinister. Grimsby's expertise with lavender and his grudge against Tuttle made him a compelling suspect, while Miss Price's bitterness and her strategic view of the post office hinted at hidden depths. The stranger in the grey coat, fleeting and enigmatic, added another layer to the puzzle. Miss Marple knew that the solution lay in connecting these elements, and she resolved to pursue a new line of inquiry, the nature of the poison itself. Rising from her chair, she crossed to a small bookshelf where an old herbal compendium, a gift from her father, held pride of place. Its pages, worn but meticulously preserved, offered a wealth of knowledge on plants and their properties. She turned to the section on lavender, her fingers tracing the faded text. Lavender oil, it noted, was prized for its soothing fragrance, but could also mask less pleasant odors, including those of certain toxins. Arsenic, for instance, was odorless in small doses and could be absorbed through the skin, especially if mixed with a carrier-like oil. Cyanide, too, could be concealed, its faint almond-like scent easily overwhelmed by lavender's potency. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she considered the parcel's sticky texture. Could the poison have been applied to the paper, designed to seep into Tuttle's hands as he handled it? She closed the book and reached for the telephone, a modern contraption she used sparingly but found useful in such moments. Dialing Dr. Haydock's number, she waited as the line crackled to life. The doctor, though likely preparing for bed, answered with his usual briskness. "Miss Marple, I might have guessed you'd be burning the midnight oil. What's on your mind?" "I'm sorry to disturb you, doctor," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been thinking about Mr. Tuttle's condition. You mentioned a toxin possibly absorbed through the skin. Have you had any results from the laboratory in Muchbenham?" Haydock sighed, the sound carrying through the receiver. "Just came in this evening, as it happens. The tests confirm arsenic poisoning trace amounts in his blood, consistent with skin absorption. It's a slow-acting dose, thankfully, which is why he's recovering. The parcel's wrapping is the likely source, though the lab's still analyzing it. They found lavender oil on the paper, but nothing else conclusive yet. It's a devilish thing, arsenics, colorless, odorless, and easy enough to come by if you know where to look." Miss Marple nodded, though he could not see her. "Arsenic, you say? And the lavender oil would it mask any trace of the poisons?" "Application, easily," Haydock replied. "Lavender's strong enough to cover most smells, and if the arsenic was mixed into an oil-based solution, it could adhere to the paper and transfer to the skin. Whoever did this knew what they were about, clever but wicked." Thanking him, Miss Marple hung up, her mind racing. Arsenic was a poison of opportunity, available in rat baits and gardening supplies, and Grimsby's shed, with its array of bottles, came sharply into focus. She recalled her visit to his garden, the glimpse of labelled jars, and his defensive manner when questioned about lavender oil. Yet Miss Price's reaction to the mention of lavender and the bold script on her letters suggested she, too, warranted scrutiny. The stranger in the grey coat remained a shadow, but Miss Marple suspected a local hand behind the crime, someone with intimate knowledge of Tuttle's routines. She settled back into her chair, her eyes drifting to the darkened garden beyond. The window, The parcel's design was no accident. The return to sender address ensured Tuttle would handle it repeatedly, increasing his exposure to the poison. The lavender, she realized, was not just a mask, but a signature, pointing to someone with access to it in quantity. Grimsby's lavender beds were an obvious source, but Miss Price's vase of dried blooms and her proximity to the post office could not be ignored. Miss Marple recalled a case from her youth, where a jealous seamstress had sent a scented shawl laced with a skin irritant to a rival. The motive had been envy over a trivial prize, but the method was strikingly similar disguised, deliberate and deceptively simple. The next step, she decided, was to secure a sample of handwriting. The parcel's bold, looping script was distinctive, and both Grimsby and Miss Price were potential matches. Grimsby had written to the village council about a drainage issue, a letter likely filed at the parish office, while Miss Price maintained the church flower rota, her neat records accessible through Mrs. Clement. Miss Marple made a mental note to visit the vicarage tomorrow, under the guise of discussing the upcoming harvest festival. For now, she needed to consider the motives driving such an act. Grimsby's anger over a misdelivered letter, though seemingly petty, could have festered into a deeper resentment, especially if his pride as a meticulous man was wounded. Miss Price's feud with the Tuttles, sparked by a damaged book, seemed trivial, but Miss Marple knew that small slights could grow monstrous in a village's close confines. As the clock struck 10, she rose to make a cup of tea, her movements slow but purposeful. The act of brewing, measuring the leaves, heating the water, waiting for the steep gave her mind room to wander. She thought of the stranger in the grey coat, described by both Mrs. Clement and Miss Price as hurried and elusive. His presence suggested an outsider, yet the parcel's design required knowledge of the post office's inner workings. Could he be a hired hand, paid to deliver the package and vanish? Or was he a distraction, a shadow cast to obscure the truth? Culprit. Miss Marple recalled a village scandal years ago, where a hired messenger had delivered anonymous letters to stir discord. The mastermind had been a local, using an outsider to deflect suspicion. Returning to her chair, tea in hand, she considered the lavender itself. Its overpowering scent, described by Mrs. Tuttle as almost chemical, suggested a concentrated oil, not the gentle fragrance of a sachet. Grimsby's shed was the logical source, but Miss Price's defensive reaction to the mention of lavender hinted at her own familiarity with it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing as she recalled the letters on Miss Price's shelf. The bold script had caught her. Too brief to confirm, but tantalizingly familiar. She would need to compare it to the parcel's handwriting, and soon. The village outside was silent now, save for the occasional creak of a gate or the distant call of a night bird. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human element of the crime. Arsenic was a poison of patience, its effects slow and insidious, suggesting a culprit who planned carefully, perhaps over weeks. Grimsby's meticulous nature fit the profile, but Miss Price's watchful habits and sharp intellect made her equally capable. The stranger, if involved, was likely a tool, not the mastermind. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her fingers itching to pick up her knitting, but restrained by the urgency of her thoughts. She rose again, crossing to her writing desk, where she kept a small notebook for such occasions. In it, she jotted down the key details: the parcel's address, the lavender oil, the arsenic, the handwriting. Beside each, she noted the suspects: Grimsby, Miss Price, the stranger, and their possible motives. Grimsby's wounded pride, Miss Price's festering grudge, the stranger's unknown role. She paused, her pen hovering over the page, and added, "A question, who benefits from Tuttle's absence?" The post office was the heart of the village, its routines known to all. An attack on Tuttle was an attack on that order, but to what end? Closing the notebook, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her eyes fixed on the darkened window. The lavender scent, the sticky paper, the cryptic address, they were threads in a tapestry of deception, woven by a hand both cunning and cruel. She recalled her nephew Raymond's fondness for detective novels, where clues were often too neat, too convenient. Real life, she knew, was messier, but no less revealing. The truth lay in the details, the tilt of a letter, the choice of a scent, the weight of a grudge. As the clock chimed 11, Miss Marple extinguished the lamp, the room falling into shadow. Tomorrow she would visit the vicarage to secure Miss Price's handwriting and perhaps call on Constable Reed for Grimsby's letter to the council. The stranger's identity might require a broader inquiry, perhaps through the much Benham postmaster, who handled regional deliveries. For now, she let her thoughts settle, each clue a stitch in the pattern of a crime that demanded her patience and her wit. The lavender scent lingered in her mind, a fragrant riddle that promised answers, if only she could find the right thread to pull. Chapter 8. The handwriting cluth. Morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a crisp clarity. The sky a pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud, and the village stirring to life with the gentle rhythm of daily routines. The air carried the scent of dew-damp grass and the faint chime of the church bell, signalling the start of another day. Yet for Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, the calm was merely a backdrop to the intricate puzzle of the poisoned parcel that had felled Mr. Ernest Tuttle, her inquiries into Mr. Grimsby's lavender-laden shed, Miss Price's sharp-eyed observations, and the elusive stranger in the grey coat had woven a web of suspicion. But the heart of the mystery remained tantalizingly out of reach. The lavender scent, the arsenic-laced wrapping, and the bold, looping handwriting on the parcel were threads she was determined to tie together, and today she resolved to pursue a critical clue. The handwriting itself, Miss Marple's parlour, with its neat furnishings and vase of late roses, was a haven of quiet reflection, but her mind was anything but still. The parcel's address, written in a distinctive script, had struck her as a deliberate marker, a signature of sorts that could point directly to the culprit. Her visit to Mr. Grimsby had revealed his guarded nature and his access to lavender, while Miss Price's defensive reaction to questions about her own use of the scent suggested hidden depths. The stranger remained a shadow, but Miss Marple suspected a local hand behind the crime, someone with intimate knowledge of the post office's workings. The handwriting, she felt, was the key to unlocking the truth, and she had a plan to secure a sample from Mr. Grimsby, whose letter to the village council might hold the answer. After breakfast, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, the silk rose on the brim catching the morning light, and set out for the village hall. The hall, a modest building beside the church, housed the parish records, including correspondence from residents like Grimsby, who was known to write frequently about drainage and hedges. As she walked, her steps measured but purposeful, she passed the post office, where Mrs. Tuttle was opening the shutters, her face still etched with worry. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod, but did not stop. Her mind focused on the task ahead. At the village hall, she found Mr. Phipps, the parish clerk, sorting through a stack of papers with his usual air of mild exasperation, a portly man with spectacles perched on his nose. He greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, a pleasure, as always." Come to check the flower rota, I suppose. Mrs. Clement's been after me to update it. Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. Not today, Mr. Phipps, though I'll speak to Mrs. Clement soon. I was wondering if you might have a letter from Mr. Grimsby, something recent, perhaps, about the drainage issue. I'm helping with a small matter for the council, and his input would be useful. Phipps raised an eyebrow, but did not question her. Grimsby's always writing about something, drains, hedges, you name it. Let me see. He rummaged through a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder labeled correspondence. After a moment, he produced a letter, its envelope bearing a bold, looping script. Here's one from last month, about the culvert near his cottage. Will that do? Miss Marple took the letter, her fingers careful not to smudge the ink. Perfect, Mr. Phipps. May I borrow it briefly? I'll return it by tomorrow. He nodded, and she tucked the letter into her handbag, her heart quickening. The script was strikingly similar to the parcel's address, with its distinctive flourishes on the capitals and the slight slant of the letters. She would need to compare it directly to the parcel, but the resemblance was promising. Her next stop was the police house, where Constable Reed was polishing his bicycle, his face flushed with effort. He straightened as she approached, his expression a mix of respect and apprehension. Miss Marple, back again, are you? I suppose it's about the parcel. The inspector's coming this afternoon, but I can show you what we've got. Thank you, Constable, she said, her voice soft but firm. I'd like to see the parcel again, if I may. There's a detail I wish to confirm. Reed led her inside, retrieving the parcel from the safe with his tongs and placing it on a clean sheet of paper. The lavender scent, though fainter now, was still potent, and the bold handwriting stood out starkly against the brown paper. Miss Marple opened her handbag and, with a murmured apology for the inconvenience, produced Grimsby's letter. Holding it beside the parcel, she studied the scripts side by side. The similarity was unmistakable. The loops on the R&S, in return to sender, matched those in Grimsby's signature, and the slant of the letters was identical. Even the pressure of the pen, firm and deliberate, was consistent. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. Most interesting, she murmured. The handwriting is quite distinctive, don't you think, Constable? Reed peered at the two documents, his brow furrowing. I suppose it is. Looks similar, doesn't it? But handwriting can be copied, can't it? I mean, anyone could mimic it, if they tried. Miss Marple nodded, her tone encouraging. Indeed, Constable, but it requires skill and intent, and this script is so particular bold, almost theatrical. It suggests someone confident in their hand, someone who writes often. She paused, considering Miss Price's letters, glimpsed on her shelf. I wonder if you might have any records from Miss Price, perhaps? A note to the council or the church, rota. It would be useful to compare. Reed scratched his head. Miss Price. She's always sending notes about the flower arrangements. I think Mrs. Clement keeps those at the vicarage. I can ask, if you like, but I'm not sure it's proper to go digging through everyone's writing. Miss Marple smiled, patting his arm. You're quite right to be cautious, Constable. Perhaps I'll speak to Mrs. Clement myself, who've been most helpful. She left the police house, the letter still in her handbag, her mind racing. Grimsby's handwriting was a strong lead, but she needed to rule out Miss Price, whose bitterness and proximity to the post office made her a plausible suspect. The stranger in the grey coat, though intriguing, seemed less likely to have crafted such a precise trap. Given his fleeting presence, Her steps took her to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers in the hall, her cheerful demeanour a contrast to the morning's gravity. Miss Marple, twice in 2 days, what a treat. Come for the harvest festival plans, I hope. Miss Marple chuckled, settling into a chair. Soon, my dear, but today I'm tying up a loose end. I understand Miss Price keeps the flower Rotomite. I see a sample of her writing. I'm helping with a small matter for the parish. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened, but she nodded, fetching a ledger from a drawer. Lavinia's very particular about the Rotorites, it out herself. Here's the latest. She opened the ledger, revealing a page of neat, angular handwriting, quite unlike the bold loops of the parcel. Miss Marple studied it, her suspicion of Miss Price diminishing slightly. The script was precise, almost austere, with none of the flourish of Grimsby's hand or the parcel's address. Thank you, Mrs. Clement, she said, closing the ledger. This is most helpful. And tell me, have you heard any more about the stranger in the grey coat? He seems to have caused quite a stir. Mrs. Clement shook her head, arranging a sprig of chrysanthemum. Not a word. He was gone as quick as he came, according to Lavinia. Probably just a traveller passing through. But with all this talk of poison, one does wonder. Miss Marple took her leave, her mind buzzing with the new evidence. Grimsby's handwriting was a near-perfect match, strengthening her suspicion, but she knew better than to leap to conclusions. The arsenic, the lavender, the address all pointed to a calculated act, and Grimsby's grudge over a misdelivered letter provided a motive, however petty. Yet she recalled a case from her youth where a forged letter had misled a village into suspecting the wrong person. Could someone have mimicked Grimsby's script to cast blame? She resolved to revisit the post office, to learn more about Tuttle's routines and any other visitors that day. As she walked home, the village was alive with midday activity, children playing, a grocer unloading crates, the postman's van trundling by. Miss Marple paused at the post office, where Mrs. Tuttle was sorting letters, her movements weary but determined. Miss Marple, she said, managing a weak smile, any news? Ernest's improving, thank goodness, but I can't rest easy until we know who did this. Miss Marple patted her hand. We're getting closer, my dear. Tell me, did Mr. Grimsby ever mention his dispute with Ernest to you directly, or anyone else who seemed particularly upset? Mrs. Tuttle frowned, thinking, Lionel was sharp about that letter, yes. Came in a month ago, all red-faced, saying it cost him a deal. Ernest tried to explain, said the address was smudged, but Lionel wouldn't hear it. No one else has been so cross, though Lavinia Price is always complaining. She's never liked us much, not since that book business. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions coalescing. Grimsby's motive was clear, his handwriting incriminating, but she needed one final piece to confirm her theory. She thanked Mrs. Tuttle and returned home, the village settling into the warmth of the afternoon. In her parlour, she sat with Grimsby's letter and her notebook, comparing the scripts again. The match was undeniable, but she knew the truth required more than coincidence. She would need to test Grimsby, perhaps by spreading a rumour that Tuttle had recalled a detail about the parcel. Such a tactic, she knew, could provoke a reaction, revealing the guilty hand. As the clock struck noon, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the garden beyond. The lavender scent, the arsenic, the handwriting, they were stitches in a pattern of deception, crafted by a mind both cunning and cruel. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of detective novels, where Clues were often too tidy. Life, she knew, was messier, but the truth was there, waiting to be unraveled, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a warm, golden haze that softened the edges of its thatched cottages and cast long shadows across the green. The air was alive with the hum of late summer bees buzzing among the roses, the distant clatter of a cart, the soft laughter of children playing near the church. Yet beneath this idyllic surface, a quiet tension simmered, stirred by the sinister affair of the poisoned parcel that had struck down Mr. Ernest Tuttle. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlour with a cup of tea growing cold, felt the weight of the mystery pressing upon her. Her inquiries had woven a tapestry of Clouster lavender-scented wrapping. The arsenic-laced paper, the bold, looping handwriting that matched Mr. Grimsby's, but the final thread remained elusive. She was convinced that Grimsby's grudge, fueled by a misdelivered letter, lay at the heart of the crime, but suspicion was not proof. To catch a culprit, she would need to set a trap, subtle and precise, like a stitch carefully placed in her knitting dot. Miss Marple's parlour was a haven of calm, its shelves lined with books, a vase of late dahlias glowing on the table, and her knitting basket tucked beside her armchair. Yet her needles lay untouched, her mind too occupied with the puzzle at hand. The handwriting match had been a breakthrough, its bold loops tying Grimsby to the parcel with near certainty. Miss Price's angular script, glimpsed in the flower, Rota had eliminated her as the writer, though her bitterness and watchful nature kept her on the periphery of suspicion. The stranger in the grey coat, described as fleeting and furtive, remained a question mark, but Miss Marple's instincts pointed to a local mind behind the crime, someone with intimate knowledge of Tuttle's routines. Grimsby, with his lavender expertise in festering resentment, fit the profile, but she needed evidence that would hold in the face of scrutiny. Her thoughts turned to a strategy she had used before, in a village scandal years ago, where a whispered rumour had flushed out. A gossip. If she could convince the village that Mr. Tuttle had recalled a specific detail about the parcels, something incriminating, yet vague, it might provoke Grimsby into revealing himself. A guilty man, she knew, often betrayed his nerve when he believed his scheme was unravelling. She sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing as she devised the plan. Mrs. Tuttle, with her access to the village grapevine, would be the perfect conduit for the rumour, and Constable Reed could be enlisted to watch for any suspicious behaviour. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, the silk rose on the brim catching the light as she stepped into the garden. The village was settling into the drowsy warmth of late afternoon, its rhythm unbroken save for the occasional villager pausing to exchange news. She made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Tuttle was behind the counter, sorting letters with a weary determination. Her face, still pale from worry, brightened slightly at Miss Marple's approach. "Miss Marple," she said, setting aside a stack of envelopes, "it's good of you to come. Ernest's much better today, Doctor. Haydock says he'll be home soon, but I can't rest until we know who did this." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing but firm. "We're getting closer, my dear. I've been thinking about the parcel, and I have a small plan that might help. Would you be willing to assist me? It involves a little misdirection, but for a good cause." Mrs. Tuttle's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Anything to catch the wretch who hurt Ernest. What do you need me to do?" Miss Marple leaned closer, her tone conspiratorial. "I'd like you to mention to a few trusted souls, Mrs. Clement, perhaps, or the grocer, that Ernest has recalled something about the parcel. Say he noticed a peculiar mark on the wrapping paper, something distinctive, like a smudge or a tear. Don't be too specific. But let it be known he shared this with the police. It's not true, of course, but it may stir someone to act unwisely. Mrs. Tuttle hesitated, then nodded, her jaw set. I can do that. Mrs. Clement's coming in later for stamps, and the grocer's boy is always about. I'll make sure it spreads. But what are you hoping for? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes, my dear, a guilty conscience betrays itself when it fears discovery. We shall see what happens. She thanked Mrs. Tuttle and left the post office, her steps taking her to the police house, where Constable Reed was polishing his boots, his face flushed with effort. Miss Marple, he said, standing hastily, you're keeping me busy. I suppose it's about the parcel again. Indeed, Constable, she replied, her eyes twinkling. I've asked Mrs. Tuttle to spread a small rumour that Mr. Tuttle has recalled a mark on the parcel's wrapping. Something he's told the police. It's not true, but I believe it may provoke a reaction. Could you keep an eye on Mr. Grimsby this evening? His cottage, the post office, anywhere he might go. If he acts oddly, it could be telling. Reed's brow furrowed, but he nodded. You think Grimsby's our man. That handwriting match was something, I'll admit. I'll watch him, though I hope the inspector doesn't think I'm overstepping. You're doing splendidly, Miss Marple assured him. Just note what you see and let me know. Discretion, of course, is key. She left the police house, her mind buzzing with anticipation. The trap was set, its threads carefully laid, and she felt the quiet thrill of a hunter sensing the quarry's approach as evening fell. The village took on a softer hue, the sky deepening to a rich indigo. Miss Marple returned home, pausing at her gate to survey the post office across the green. Its windows glowed faintly, Mrs. Tuttle still at work, and she imagined the rumour taking root, spreading like ivy through the village's gossip. She entered her cottage, where Janet had left a tray of tea and scones, and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The plan was simple, but risky. Grimsby, if guilty, might attempt to cover his tracks, perhaps by retrieving or destroying evidence. If innocent, he would do nothing, and her suspicions would need redirecting. The clock ticked toward 8, and Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the clues she had gathered. The arsenic, confirmed by Dr. Haydock, was a poison of patience. Its slow effects suggesting a culprit who planned meticulously. Grimsby's shed, with its bottles and jars, was a likely source, and his handwriting matched the parcel's script with uncanny precision. Miss Price, though bitter, seemed less likely, her angular writing and lack of lavender expertise diminishing her role. The stranger in the grey coat, described by multiple witnesses, was a puzzle, perhaps a hired hand, but more likely a distraction. Given the crime's intimate design, she recalled a case from her youth, where a village baker had spread a false rumour to flush out a thief, watching as the culprit betrayed himself by checking a hidden stash. The strategy had worked then, and she hoped it would now. Grimsby's guarded nature, his quick denial of involvement, and his access to lavender oil made him the prime suspect, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances alone. She sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the darkened garden, where the shadows seemed to pulse with secrets. At 9:30, a soft knock at the door startled her. It was Constable Reed, his face flushed and his breath quick. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "you were right to watch Grimsby. I followed him, as you asked, and not Anne. Hour ago, he slipped out of his cottage and headed to the post office. He was carrying a small bag, and he tried the back door, looked like he was trying to get in. I caught him before he could do anything, and he claimed he was checking for a lost letter. But here's the thing, he had another parcel, wrapped in brown paper, and it smelled of lavender, just like the first. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained calm. Another parcel, you say? Where is it now? Locked in the safe, Reed replied. I brought him to the police house, and he's waiting there, none too happy. I haven't opened the parcel yet, thought I'd better tell you first. What do you make of it? Miss Marple rose, her eyes gleaming. I think, Constable, that Mr. Grimsby has made a misstep. Let us go to the police house and see this parcel, and perhaps send for Dr. Haydock. He'll want to examine it for arsenic. As they walked through the darkened village, the stars bright above, Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Grimsby's attempt to enter the post office, prompted by the rumour, suggested a man desperate to cover his tracks. The second parcel, scented with lavender, was a damning echo of the first. She recalled her nephew Raymond's tales of detective novels, where culprits often betrayed themselves by acting too soon. Grimsby, it seemed, had done just that at the police house. Grimsby sat in a chair, his face pale and his hands clenched. The new parcel lay on Reed's desk, its brown paper and bold handwriting a near mirror of the original. Miss Marple studied it, noting the familiar sheen and the sharp lavender scent. Mr. Grimsby, she said softly, this is most unfortunate. Perhaps you'd care to explain why you were at the post office tonight, with a parcel so like the one that harmed Mr. Tuttle. Grimsby's eyes darted, but he said nothing, his silence as telling as any confession. Miss Marple turned to Reed, her voice calm but firm. I think, Constable, we should wait for Dr. Haydock and the inspector. This parcel may hold the final clue we need. As they waited, the village slept, its secrets poised to unravel. Miss Marple stood by the window, her eyes on the post office across the green. The trap had worked, its threads pulling tight, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a mystery nearing its end, stitched by careful stitch. Chapter 10. The Confession, the Village Hall of St. Mary Mead. A sturdy building of weathered stone beside the church stood bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its windows casting golden rectangles onto the darkened green. The night was still, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of late summer blooms, but within the hall an atmosphere of tense anticipation prevailed. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat set aside and her coat neatly folded over a chair, stood near the long oak table where village meetings were typically held. Tonight, however, the hall served a graver purpose. The unravelling of the mystery that had shaken the village, the poisoning of Mr. Ernest Tuttle by a lavender-scented parcel. Her carefully laid trap had borne fruit, ensnaring Mr. Lionel Grimsby, who now sat across from her, his face pale and his hands fidgeting under the scrutiny of Constable Reed and Dr. Haydock. The hall's high ceiling echoed faintly with the creak of chairs and the occasional rustle of papers as Reed arranged his notes. Grimsby, his wiry frame hunched, avoided eye contact, his grey eyes darting to the new parcel on the tabula, near twin of the one that had felled Tuttle, its brown paper exuding the same sharp lavender scent. Miss Marple's plan to spread a rumour that Tuttle had recalled a distinctive mark on the original parcel had provoked Grimsby into action, leading him to the post office with this second package. The trap had been subtle, its threads woven with the precision of her knitting, and now the moment of truth had arrived. Constable read, His young face, set with determination, cleared his throat. "Mr. Grimsby," he began, his voice firm but tinged with unease, "you've some explaining to do. We caught you at the post office tonight, trying to get in with this parcel. It's too much like the one that poisoned Mr. Tuttle. Same wrapping, same smell. What were you up to?" Grimsby's jaw tightened, and he shifted in his chair, his fingers twisting a loose thread on his sleeve. "I told you," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "I was checking for a lost letter. That parcel's nothing to do with me. I found it outside the postbox. Thought I'd hand it in." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the table, tilted her head, her pale blue eyes steady but kind. "Come now, Mr. Grimsby," she said softly, her tone that of a gentle aunt chiding a wayward nephew. "That explanation is rather thin, don't you think? The parcel is wrapped in the same paper as the first, with the same bold handwriting, and it carries the same lavender scent, quite distinctive, as I'm sure you know, given your expertise with the plant, and to be caught at the post office so soon after Mrs. Tuttle mentioned Ernest recalling a mark on the original well. It does suggest you were concerned about something being discovered." Grimsby's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the new parcel with gloved hands, interrupted. "There's more, Grimsby," he said, his voice grave. "I've had a quick look at this one, and it's sticky, just like the first, likely laced with the same arsenic solution. The lab's still testing the original, but I'd wager this is no coincidence. You'd better start talking, man, before the inspector arrives from Much Benham." Grimsby's composure cracked, his shoulders slumping as he buried his face in his hands. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the hall's old clock, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to the man's growing distress. Miss Marple watched him closely, her expression calm but unwavering, like a gardener observing a plant about to yield its secrets. She had seen such moments before, when guilt, like a dammed stream, could no longer be contained. "I didn't mean for it to go so far," Grimsby said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. He lifted his head, his eyes haunted. "I only wanted to frighten him, to make him pay for his carelessness. Tuttle ruined a deal for Mia, big one, with a seed supplier in London. That letter he misdelivered was my chance to expand my nursery, and he sent it to Mrs. Harrow by mistake. Cost me hundreds, maybe more. He brushed it off, said it was a smudge on the address, but I knew he just didn't care." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle but probing. "And so you decided to send a parcel, Mr. Grimsby, one that would ensure—" He noticed. Grimsby swallowed, his hands trembling. "Yes, I mixed a bit of arsenic, nothing lethal, just enough to make him ill. Got it from an old rat bait in the shed. I mixed it with lavender oil to cover any smell, wrapped it in paper I'd treated with the solution. The return to sender was to make sure he'd handle it himself, puzzling over it. I thought he'd get sick, miss a few days, learn a lesson. I never meant to kill him." Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose, but he remained silent, his gloved hands still holding the parcel. Constable Reed scribbled notes, his face a mix of shock and determination. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Grimsby. "And the second parcel," she asked, "the one you brought tonight, was that to replace the first, or to ensure it wasn't traced back to you?" Grimsby's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "I heard what Mrs. Tuttle was saying about Tuttle remembering a mark. I thought he'd seen something, maybe a fingerprint or a tear I'd missed. I panicked. I made another parcel, same as the first, thinking I could swap it out, make it look like a mistake. But I swear, I didn't want to hurt him again. I just wanted to cover my tracks. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. Jealousy and pride, Mr. Grimsby, are dangerous things. They cloud the mind and lead to acts one cannot undo. You knew the post office's routines, didn't you? You knew Mr. Tuttle would handle that parcel himself, turning it over, trying to solve its mystery. And the lavender your own, I presume. From your splendid beds. Grimsby nodded, his face ashen. I distilled the oil myself. Its strong covers anything. I thought it would keep anyone from noticing the arsenic. I was careful, used gloves, made sure the paper was just right. But I didn't think he'd get so sick. I thought he'd just feel poorly for a day or two. Constable Reed looked up. From his notes, his voice stern. That's no excuse, Grimsby. Poison's poison, whether you meant to kill or not. You'll have to answer for this when the inspector gets here. Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture calming. Let us be thorough, Constable. Mr. Grimsby, what of the stranger in the grey coat? Several people saw him at the post office, posting a package. Was he part of your plan? Grimsby frowned, his confusion genuine. Stranger? I don't know anything about a stranger. I posted the parcel myself, in the evening post box, the day before Tuttle fell ill. No one else was involved. I swear it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. The stranger's role, then, was a separate thread. Perhaps a coincidence or a misdirection. She made a mental note to pursue it later, perhaps through inquiries at Much Benham's post office. For now, Grimsby's confession was the heart of the matter, its details aligning with the clues she had painstakingly gathered. The handwriting, the lavender, the arsenical pointed to a man driven by wounded pride, his meticulous nature. Turned to malice. Dr. Haydock set the parcel down, his voice grim. This'll need to go to the lab, but it's clear enough what we're dealing with. Grimsby, you're lucky Tuttle's recovering, or you'd be facing worse than a charge of assault. Grimsby hung his head, his voice barely audible. No, I'm sorry. I couldn't let it go. He made me look a fool, and I wanted him to feel it. Miss Marple stepped back, her role in the confrontation complete. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness for the frailties that drove men to such acts. She recalled a case from her youth, where a shopkeeper had tampered with a rival's goods over a lost customer. The motive had been petty, the method crude, but the intent was the same, a desire to wound, born of envy. Grimsby's crime was more sophisticated, but its roots were no different. Constable Reed rose, his face resolute. I'll take him to the station, Miss Marple. The inspector'll want to hear this, and we'll need to search his shed for that arsenic. Thank you, you've a way of getting to the truth. Miss Marple smiled faintly, gathering her coat. I only listen, Constable, and watch. The truth has a way of revealing itself, if one is patient. She left the hall, the cool night air. A bomb after the tension within. The village slept, its cottages dark and peaceful, but Miss Marple's mind was still at work. The stranger in the grey coat nagged at her, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy pattern. She resolved to inquire further, perhaps through the regional postmaster, but for now, the case was all but closed. As she walked home, the stars bright. Above, she reflected on the village's quiet complexities. St. Mary Mead, with its roses and routines, was a microcosm of human nature, its surface calm masking currents of resentment and pride. She entered her cottage, the familiar warmth of her parlour a contrast to the night's chill, and settled into her armchair. Her knitting lay waiting, but she left it untouched, her thoughts lingering on Grimsby's confession. The lavender scent, the arsenic, the handwriting, they had formed a trap of his own making, and Miss Marple had merely pulled the threads to unravel it. Chapter 11. The village restored. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle radiance, painting the village in hues of soft gold and pink. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dukest grass and the faint sweetness of late summer blooms, as the village stirred to life with its familiar rhythms, milk cans clattering, a dog's cheerful bark, the distant chime of the church bell calling the faithful to early service. The turmoil of the past few days, sparked by the sinister affair of the poisoned parcel that had struck down Mr. Ernest Tuttle, seemed to recede like a fading shadow, though its echoes lingered in the whispers of villagers passing on the high street. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a neatly buttered scone, felt a quiet satisfaction tempered by the melancholy that always accompanied the resolution of a mystery. Her carefully laid trap had ensnared Mr. Lionel Grimsby, his confession in the village hall laying bare a tale of wounded pride and reckless malice. But the final threads of the puzzle, the stranger in the grey coat and the deeper currents of village life still tugged at her thoughts. Miss Marple's parlour, with its polished furniture and vase of late dahlias, was a haven of order, its calm a stark contrast to the drama that had unfolded the previous night. Her knitting basket sat untouched, for her mind was still weaving the details of the case. The lavender-scented parcel, the arsenic-laced wrapping, the bold handwriting that matched Grimsby's, and his desperate attempt to cover his tracks with a second parcel. His confession, wrung from a guilty conscience provoked by her rumour, had confirmed her suspicions, yet the stranger's role remained an enigma. As she sipped her tea, her pale blue eyes fixed on the garden beyond the window, she considered the human frailties that had driven Grimsby to such an pride. Envy, a festering grudge over a misdelivered letter. It was a story as old as the village itself, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of such motives, knew that St. Mary Mead held many such secrets beneath its tranquil surface. Her morning's task was to visit the post office, to offer her support to Mrs. Tuttle and to gauge the village's mood now that the culprit was in custody. She donned her coat and straw hat, the silk rose on the brim catching the sunlight, and stepped into the garden where the roses glowed against the dew. The high street was alive with activity, children scampering to school, the grocer arranging apples, the postman's van trundling by with its familiar rattle. The post office, its brick facade warmed by the sun, stood open, and Miss Marple found Mrs. Tuttle behind the counter, her face weary but brightened by relief. Mrs. Tuttle exclaimed, setting aside a stack of letters. "I can't thank you enough. Ernest is coming home today. Dr. Haydock says he's nearly himself again, and to think it was Mr. Grimsby all along. I never would have believed it, but Constable Reed told me everything, how you set that clever trap. You've saved us, truly." Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but modest. "I only asked a few questions, my dear, and listened to what the village had to say. Mr. Grimsby's actions were his own undoing. I'm so pleased to hear Ernest is recovering. Will he return to work soon?" Mrs. Tuttle nodded, her hands busy with the day's post. "Tomorrow, if he's up to it. He's eager to be back, though I've told him to take it slow. We're being careful now, handling parcels without gloves, just in case. And the village has been so kind. Mrs. Clement brought a pie, and the vicars offered to say a prayer for us at Sunday service. Miss Marple patted her hand, her eyes scanning the post office's orderly interior. The faint scent of lavender lingered, a ghostly reminder of the parcel, but the air felt lighter, as if the village had exhaled its fear. "You've been very brave, Mrs. Tuttle," she said. "And I wonder, have you heard any more about that stranger in the grey coat? He seems to have caused quite a stir." Mrs. Tuttle frowned, thinking, "Nothing new, I'm afraid. He posted that package and was gone before anyone could ask questions. I've been thinking it might have been a mistake, some traveller passing through, nothing to do with Grimsby's scheme. But it's odd, isn't it, that he came just then?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind turning over the detail. The stranger's fleeting presence suggested a coincidence, yet she knew that coincidences in a village like St. Mary Mead were rare. She made a mental note to inquire at the Much Benham post office, where regional deliveries were sorted, to see if any record of the man existed. For now, though, the village was healing, and her role was to ensure its peace was fully restored. As she left the post office, Miss Marple's steps took her past Willow Cottage, where Miss Lavinia Price was tending her garden, her sharp eyes flicking up at the sound of footsteps. Miss Marple offered a polite nod, but Miss Price's expression remained cool, her lips pursed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice clipped, "I hear you've caught the villain. Grimsby, of all people. I always said he was a meddler." Miss Marple paused, her tone gentle. "He was misguided, Miss Price, driven by a wounded pride. It's a reminder, isn't it, how small grievances can grow out of hand?" Miss Price sniffed, returning to her pruning. "Some people don't know when to let things go. I'm glad it's over." Her words were dismissive, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if she, too, had feared being drawn into the web of suspicion. The spinster's bitterness, though real, had not extended to poison, and Miss Marple felt a quiet relief at ruling her out. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for the church, her cheerful demeanour a balm. After Miss Price's sharpness, "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "The hero of the hour. The whole village is talking about how you caught Grimsby, such a clever trick with that rumour. You must tell me all about it over tea." Miss Marple chuckled, settling into a chair. "There's little to tell, my dear. I only suggested a possibility, and Mr. Grimsby's conscience did the rest. But I'm curious, have you heard anything more about that stranger in the grey coat? He seems to have vanished as quickly as he appeared." Mrs. Clement shook her head, pouring tea, not a whisper. "Lavinia Price mentioned him again this morning, but no one's seen him since. Probably just a traveller, don't you think? Though with all this talk of poison, one does wonder if he was up to something." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the possibility. The stranger's package, described as small and wrapped in brown paper, could have been a red herring, posted to confuse the trail. Grimsby's confession had been clear. He acted alone, using his own lavender and arsenic. Yet Miss Marple's instinct, honed by years of observing village life, told her to keep the stranger in mind. She recalled a case from her youth, where a hired messenger had delivered a tampered gift to deflect suspicion from a local culprit. The parallel was not exact, but it lingered, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy resolution as she left the vicarage. The village was basking in the midday sun, its peace restored but its undercurrents still present. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes taking in the familiar sights, the grocer's shop, the children playing, the post office now bustling with customers. Mr. Tuttle's recovery and Grimsby's arrest had lifted the cloud over St. Mary Mead, but she knew that villagers, like people, carried their secrets quietly. She paused at her gate, her gaze lingering on the post office, its brick facade a symbol of the village's heart. The lavender scent, the arsenic, the handwriting, they had formed a trap. But it was human nature that had set it in motion. Entering her cottage, Miss Marple found a basket of homemade jams on the table, a gift from Mrs. Tuttle with a note of thanks. She smiled, setting it aside, and settled into her armchair, her knitting finally within reach. The case was closed, yet the stranger's shadow lingered, a reminder that not every question found an answer. She resolved to write to the much Benham postmaster, a discreet inquiry about recent deliveries, but for now she let her thoughts rest. The village was safe, its rhythm restored, and Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a task well done, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 12. A final stitched autumn had crept into St. Mary Mead with a quiet grace, its arrival marked by the first golden leaves drifting across the village green and crispness in the air that hinted at winter's approach. The cottages, with their thatched roofs and ivy-clad walls, stood bathed in the soft light of an October morning, their chimneys trailing wisps of smoke into a sky of pale, unblemished blue. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, milk cans rattling, children scampering to school, the church bell tolling with measured solemnity, but a sense of calm had settled over St. Mary Mead, as if the resolution of the poisoned Parcel affair had mended a tear in its tranquil fabric. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour fire with a skein of pale blue wool in her lap, felt the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved, though her mind, ever restless, lingered on the subtleties that had brought the truth to light. Her parlour was a haven of order, its polished furniture aglow in the firelight, a vase of late chrysanthemums adding a burst of colour to the table. The knitting needles in her hands clicked softly, each stitch a meditation on the case that had consumed her days, the lavender-scented parcel, the arsenic-laced wrapping, the bold handwriting that had pointed to Mr. Lionel Grimsby's guilt. His confession, wrung from a guilty conscience in the village hall, had laid bare a tale of pride and resentment, sparked by a misdelivered letter that had cost him a business deal. Yet the stranger in the grey coat, a fleeting figure described by villagers, remained an unresolved thread, a shadow that tugged at Miss Marple's thoughts as she worked her wool. The case had unfolded like one of her knitting patterns, each clue a stitch carefully placed. Grimsby's lavender expertise, his guarded shed, the handwriting match, and the second parcel that had betrayed him. Her trap, a whispered rumour that Mr. Tuttle had recalled a mark on the wrapping, had been the final pull that unravelled his scheme. Now, with Grimsby in custody and Mr. Tuttle restored to his post office duties, the village had returned to its gentle routine. But Miss Marple knew that its peace was fragile, a veneer over the currents of human nature that ran beneath. As she knitted, her eyes drifted to the window, where the post office stood across the green, its brick facade warmed by the morning sun. Mr. Tuttle, she had heard, was back at work, his meticulous nature undimmed by his ordeal, though he now wore gloves. When sorting parcels, a precaution born of hard-won caution, Mrs. Tuttle's basket of jams, still on her table, was a testament to the villagers' gratitude, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling their heartfelt thanks. Yet the stranger in the grey coat nagged at her, a loose end that refused to be tied off. She had written to the much Benham postmaster, inquiring about recent deliveries, But the reply, received yesterday, had offered little. No record of a man in a grey coat, no unusual packages logged. It was possible, she mused, that he was a mere traveller. His parcel unrelated to Grimsby's crime, but her instinct, honed by years of observation, suggested otherwise. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and crossed to her writing desk, where her notebook lay open. Its pages, filled with neat jottings, chronicled the case, the parcel's details, Grimsby's motive, the stranger's description. She added a final note: stranger coincidence or misdirection. Inquire further if opportunity arises. Closing the notebook, she felt a pang of curiosity, tempered by the knowledge that not every mystery yielded all its secrets. She recalled a case from her youth where a village feud had been complicated by an outsider's letter sent to stir confusion. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that villages, like people, were layered with complexities. Her morning's plan was to visit the church, where the harvest festival preparations were underway, offering a chance to gauge the village's mood and perhaps glean more about the stranger. She donned her coat and hat, the silk rose on the brim catching the light, and stepped into the garden, where the air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. The high street was alive with activity. Grocer sweeping his doorstep, children tossing a ball, Mrs. Clement hurrying toward the church with an armful of flowers. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes taking in the familiar sights, each a thread in the tapestry of St. Mary Mead's life at the church. The nave was a flurry of preparation, with villagers arranging pumpkins and sheaves of wheat for the festival. Mrs. Clement, her cheeks flushed with effort, spotted Miss Marple and waved her over. Miss Marple just in time to help with the flowers. The village owes you so much. Everyone's talking about how you caught Grimsby. Such a dreadful business. But it's over now, thank goodness. Miss Marple smiled, picking up a bunch of marigolds. I only listened, my dear, and let the truth come to light. The village seems itself again, doesn't it? Though I wonder if anyone's mentioned that stranger in the grey coat. He's quite the mystery. Mrs. Clement shook her head, arranging a spray of ivy. Not a word since the day it happened. Lavinia Price brought him up again yesterday, but she's got nothing new. Probably just a passer-by, don't you think? Though with all that's happened, one can't help wondering. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers deftly arranging the flowers. Miss Price, pruning her garden as she passed, had offered no further insights. Her sharp eyes now focused on her roses rather than the post office. The stranger's role, if any, seemed to fade with each passing day, yet Miss Marple's mind refused to let it go. She recalled her nephew Raymond's fondness for detective novels, where every loose end was neatly tied. But real life, she knew, was less obliging. The stranger might remain a shadow, but the case was resolved. Its heart laid bare in Grimsby's confession as she left the church. The village was basking in the midday sun, its peace restored, but its undercurrents ever present. She paused. At the post office, where Mr. Tuttle himself was behind the counter, his face pale but cheerful as he sorted letters. Miss Marple, he called, his voice warm. I owe you my life, they tell me. Emily says you're a wonder, and I'm inclined to agree. Miss Marple chuckled, her expression modest. Nonsense, Mr. Tuttle. I only asked a few questions. I'm so pleased to see you well. You're taking precautions, I hope. Oh yes, he said, holding up a gloved hand. No more bare hands. For me, and Emily's keeping a sharp eye out. We're grateful. Truly come by for tea any time. She thanked him and stepped outside, her eyes lingering on the post office's facade. The lavender scent, the arsenic, the handwriting, they had formed a trap, but it was Grimsby's pride that had sprung it. She walked home, the village settling into the quiet of early afternoon, and entered her parlour, where the fire crackled. Softly, settling into her armchair, she picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The case had reminded her of human nature's complexities, the pride, the lengths to which a wounded ego could drive a man. Grimsby's act, born of a petty grudge, was a mirror to the village's hidden tensions, and Miss Marple, with her quiet observation, had merely held it up to the light as she knitted. Her thoughts drifted to the stranger, a figure who might never be explained. She recalled a village scandal years ago, where an outsider's letter had sparked a feud, only to be revealed as a prank. The stranger might be such a figure, irrelevant to the crime but a spark for suspicion. She resolved to keep an ear open, perhaps through the regional Postmaster's network. But for now, St. Mary Mead was at peace, its heart beating steadily once more. The clock struck 3, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes resting on the garden, where the last roses clung to their stems. The village, with its secrets and its simplicities, would always hold mysteries, and she would always be ready to unravel them, stitch by careful stitch. The poisoned parcel had been a dark thread, but it had been woven into the tapestry of justice, and Miss Marple, with a faint smile, felt content to let the village spin on its secrets safe in her watchful care.